Welcome to the Rediscovery channel. This is the channel where every week I, Ivor Kovac, and my good friend Stilgar take turns coming up with topics from history that the other person doesn't know about and often hasn't even heard about either. So today it is my turn, and I'm going to ask Stilgar, have you heard of the Ptolemaic Cosmology?
I have not heard about it at all. Tell me more.
Okay, well, we actually, I think I mentioned it a little bit when I did my video on the medieval mythology. Maybe I didn't mention it by name, but basically it is the geocentric worldview that our ancestors had for over 1,000 years. So it's the medieval geocentric cosmology, and it lasted roughly from 150 AD to 1543 when it began to die. But as it kind of became obsolete, some places it lasted a bit longer than others. And so it began to die and fade away in 1543 as the established scientific worldview. And it was mostly gone by the late 18th century. So it didn't go away quickly. And this is the medieval geocentric cosmology, which also involved, it was predicated on some views about the elements. So they believed that the universe and everything in it is composed of 5 basic elements. So how did it get started? So the cosmology actually begins with Aristotle, who lived from 384 to 322 BC. I'm sure you've heard of Aristotle before, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. So he was very influential, and his influence lasted for thousands of years after he was dead. So Aristotle proposes a geocentric cosmology, and he knew the Earth was round, as did most of the ancient Greeks, and pretty much any maritime civilization in the ancient world that would sail and travel long distances. So he knew the Earth was round, but he thought it was set within a series of larger concentric spheres. And the reason he said that the Earth was round, like his proof that he cited, was because the shadow that it casts on the moon is always circular, which is something, Aristotle was not a scientist, but he was a philosopher. And something like that is very easily observed and can be observed by anybody. So he believed the world was composed of 4 basic elements, which were wind, water, fire, and earth. And this idea he actually borrowed from an older Greek philosopher named Empedocles. And Empedocles lived from 490 BC to 430 BC. However, he proposed there was a 5th element that was also added later. So the heavenly spheres, he believed, were made of a 5th element called, which has been referred to as quintessence, and also aether. Means the same thing, whether you hear aether or quintessence. So this idea was actually borrowed from Timaeus, which was written by Plato. So he got the idea of the 5th element from Plato. Plato supposed that there were 5 elements because Empedocles discovered that there were only 5 solid shapes whose sides were regular polygons. And Plato was really intrigued and inspired by that. And he thought, because of that, there must actually be 5 elements. So Plato assumed that atoms must be composed of these shapes, and that each element was a different shaped atom. And of course, their idea of atoms was that it's the smallest unit of matter, which is microscopic and cannot be divided or broken down into an even smaller unit. So he thought that each atom was a different geometric shape. So since the Greeks only recognized 4 elements at the time that Plato was alive, he assumed that there must be a 5th, and that this 5th element is what the heavens were made out of. So according to Aristotle, the heavier elements, such as earth, water, and air, sank towards the center of the universe. And it was in the nature of fire to rise. So there must be a zone above the zone of air where the fire is trying to get to. So the Earth is surrounded by a sphere of fire, which is above the atmosphere. The moon, sun, stars, and planets were embedded in perfect spheres of this fifth element. And that's what causes them to move and rotate. They're trapped in it like a giant moving sphere that goes around and around. And aether is thought to be a perfect and pure substance, which engages in constant circular motion and is not subject to change. So Aristotle thought, he took these ideas from older philosophers and kind of merged them together. So Plato came up with the idea of the fifth element, but Aristotle put together this worldview. And the idea is that it's the nature that the earthly elements are trying to return to a state of rest, but they do get disturbed by things. And when they get disturbed, their movements are irregular. But the aether, which composes the heavenly realm, doesn't get disturbed, and it constantly moves in a regular fashion. And for the most part, it's transparent. So you don't really see it with your eyes, but you see its effects because the heavenly bodies are moved. So basically, it's in the nature of earthly elements to return to a state of rest. And it's in the nature of aether, the heavenly element, to move continuously. So the sphere of the moon is what comes after. So like we have the surface of the earth, and then we have the atmosphere, which is the element of air. And then above that, there's another sphere, which is the element of fire. And then there's the sphere of aether, which contains the moon. It's the first, the sphere of the moon is the first sphere of aether as well. So the sphere of the moon is the boundary between the earthly zone and the heavenly zone. And it's contaminated with some of the earthly elements, which is referred to as the sublunary realm, the realm of earthly elements and irregular motion. And that's why there's modeling on the moon and spots. It's because it's being contaminated by the less pure elements of the earthly realm. So Aristotle proposed that there were 55 spheres surrounding the earth, and the last sphere, or something beyond it, was referred to as the prime mover. And the prime mover is what set the heavenly spheres in motion. So that's the view that Aristotle had. And I should mention that he was actually opposed by somebody named Aristarchus of Samos. And Aristarchus lived from 310 BC to 230. And he actually proposed a heliocentric model. And he was probably the first person to do so, though not necessarily. So he proposed his heliocentric model in 270 BC and put the planets, the planets that were known to them back then, he actually put them in correct order. And he said that the sun is the hearth of the sky, I guess meaning that it's the main source of heat. So it was absurd to think that the hearth would be the object which is moving. And his ideas were considered and rejected because people, they liked Aristotle's view better. And this is bearing in mind that Aristarchus was an actual scientist who did mathematical calculations and made observations, whereas Aristotle was not a scientist, he was a philosopher. But I guess Aristotle was better at using rhetoric, so his view prevailed as far as the regular people were concerned, and then the scientific establishment as well, like they accepted his view. So moving on a little bit, there was another guy named Eratosthenes. Have you heard of Eratosthenes before?
No, never.
Yeah.
But I would disagree that Aristotle wasn't a scientist. I think he's sometimes credited as being a father of science to some extent, or at least teaching science. But,
I mean, he taught logic, but
yeah,
yeah, I think he was a philosopher. I don't believe he was a scientist. I mean, according to
he also wrote a book like on physics, on having a ball fall through a fluid, and that the speed of the ball can be calculated based on the weight of the ball in relation to the density of the fluid. So he did do some scientific observations, I would say. But
okay.
yeah, okay. But who was the second person you mentioned? Because I have not heard of this person at all.
Yeah, most people haven't. I think his name was Eratosthenes. He was another Greek scientist, but he actually lived in North Africa. I think originally he was born in the area that we'd call Libya today, but he also did a lot of work in Egypt. And he actually calculated the circumference of the Earth very close to what the actual circumference is. And I've got the value in kilometers, to make it easier for you and for most of our audience. So he calculated that the Earth was 40,320 kilometers wide, and the actual number is 40,030 kilometers. And he did it by measuring like the angle of shadows in different cities. He used trigonometry, I guess it was, complex math. Like I don't really do math, so I'm not going to go into all the details on that. But the main thing about Eratosthenes is that he did calculate this, the actual size of the Earth, and so it remained in knowledge and in scholarship going through all the way through the Roman period and the medieval period. So like during the medieval times, there wasn't really any debate about the shape of the Earth. They all knew it was round, and also, as far as I know, no debate about the size of the Earth. So, at any rate, that's all been kind of background information so far. So, the Ptolemaic Cosmology. This is all what kind of sets the grounds for it. The Ptolemaic Cosmology was created by a guy named Claudius Ptolemy, who lived from 100 AD to 170. So in the Latin form of his name, in case anybody cares, is actually Claudius Ptolemaeus. And if you see medieval depictions of him with a little, what do you call it, subscript underneath or description, it'll usually have like the Latin form of his name. So even though he was born in Egypt and he lived there and did most of his work in Alexandria, but he was not a real Egyptian person. He was actually of Greek descent, and he was an astronomer and mathematician. And even though his name is Ptolemy, most likely he's not at all related to the Ptolemaic dynasty that ruled Egypt. Cleopatra was the most famous and also the last of that. But that's why there were Greeks in Egypt in the first place, was because of Alexander the Great's invasion and then the Ptolemaic dynasty. But this guy's not related to the Ptolemaic dynasty, as far as anybody knows. So his first written work was called Almagest, and he wrote it in 150 AD about his astronomical observations. And the Almagest is probably not, it's not what he actually called it, but it's what people called it during the medieval period. And it's actually a corruption of Arabic and Greek. The actual name was, and I'm probably not going to pronounce this right, He Mathematici Syntaxis, which means the mathematical collection, because he thought that all astronomical phenomena and motions could be explained by math. And I believe that's actually correct. Of course, the conclusions he came to was wrong, but it is true that things do have regular motions. So he presents arguments for Earth being stationary and central, with heavenly spheres rotating around it in uniform motion and at a steady rate. So again, it's like Basically, he's also a follower of Aristotle, but he's going to make some refinements to it and some changes and some rules. And his model that he creates is what's going to prevail throughout Europe and the Mediterranean and all the way through the Middle Ages. And also the Muslims will adopt this view as well when they come into the picture. So the Ptolemaic system is fully established in another book he wrote called, in English, we would call it Planetary Hypothesis. And the original Greek name was Hypothesis ton Planomenon, which forms the basis for, of course, like the European and Islamic cosmology that prevails for over 1,000 years. And of course, in his book, each heavenly body is attached to its own sphere of aether, which is what causes it to move. So gravity is not really a part of his calculations. He's still kind of following the ideas of Aristotle. And he believes that there's no empty space between the spheres. So the spheres are perfectly smooth and crystalline, and there's actually no empty space in space. The spheres are all like nested one within the other, and they turn at different paces. And basically, he mathematically justifies the Aristotelian cosmology, and he reduces the amount of heavenly spheres. He was the first, this was the first mathematical framework for understanding the universe. So Aristotle's version didn't really involve as much math, and it wasn't really a predictive model. It was just something that was taken for granted. But what Ptolemy is going to do is he's going to use math to explain the motions, and it's going to be a predictive model, so you'll be able to know where the different bodies will appear in the sky and when. Yeah, and he did actually calculate the distance of the moon from the Earth very close to what it actually is. But again, he was working from the geocentric supposition, or presupposition rather. And of course, Earth is in the center, followed by the moon, then Mercury, Venus, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and the sphere of stars. Beyond the sphere of stars is the prime mover, also referred to as the primum mobile, which I think is Latin. And that is what sets the spheres in motion, is the prime mover. And there are varying numbers of spheres between Saturn and the prime mover, or in some cases, the prime mover comes right after Saturn, but it's broken up into varying numbers of spheres itself. Like from what I've seen, and I have a lot of medieval artwork that depicts this cosmology, so I'll be putting it in there. But sometimes the prime mover will just be one sphere. Sometimes it might be two or three. So the prime mover is, it can be divided up into the crystalline heaven, which is an empty sphere. Of course, it's made out of aether, but there's nothing in it. And then the first movable, and then Empyrean, or the highest heaven. And usually what happens, what's going to happen later is during the Middle Ages, after Christianity comes, Empyrean is going to be, it won't be a sphere, but it will be what's outside of the sphere, the place where God is. So anyways, I'll get to that when I get to that. So retrograde motion. Have you heard of this term retrograde motion before?
I mean, it sounds very familiar, but can you explain it to me?
Yeah, you've probably seen it because, if, you know, like when you were in America, you probably saw it. Like if you go to the grocery store, there's those trashy magazines at the checkout, and they'll be like celebrity gossip and horoscopes. And the kind of people that believe in horoscopes, they still talk about retrograde motion. So retrograde motion is, it derives from the Ptolemaic cosmology, which is predicated on the assumption of the Earth being at the center of the universe and everything circling around it. So if that is true, then it means that the planets are sometimes like they'll be moving in one direction and then sometimes they move back, or at least that's how it appears from the vantage point of Earth. So when it looks like the planet is moving backwards, that's what they call retrograde motion. So of course that's also, just talking about something like that, it also is kind of in defiance of Aristotle's original cosmology, because he posited that the motions are constant and perfect. So what Ptolemy does is he can't deny that it looks like planets are moving back. So he comes up with a formula to justify it, and he calls it retrograde motion. So Ptolemy said that actually the different planets, they move in circles around an invisible point inside their sphere of aether, and the invisible point that they're moving around is moving at a fixed direction and pace. So he says actually they do have perfect motions. They just happen to be circling around an invisible point that's embedded in these spheres, but that point is continuously and steadily moving. And then he had formulas to kind of explain all that. And actually, the predictive model did work. So everybody knew where all the heavenly bodies were going to be at different points in the year. And people that believe in astrology today, like to this day, they will still talk about retrograde motion. So you probably saw that when you were, checking out at the grocery store and kind of halfway paid attention to it. But it has its origins in this cosmology. Ptolemy, he just attempts to save Aristotle, and he does it using math. He creates like a way to reconcile the apparent backwards motion of the planets with the idea that the motion is constant and perfect, if that makes sense. And he gives it the term, retrograde motion. So medieval Europeans, as I mentioned earlier, when Christianity comes, they're going to separate Empyrean from the prime mover, the sphere, which is the sphere of first motion that sets the others in motion. So they're going to separate Empyrean, and they're going to say that Empyrean is the realm of God, or the heaven of God, and it is outside of the physical universe. So God is he's outside of the universe. He's not another sphere, but he sets the prime mover into motion. And in medieval artwork, whenever they would depict the entire universe as they understood it, the Ptolemaic Cosmology, they would often also depict hell as being in the center of the earth. So you might see like a depiction. If you ever look at, well, you actually are in Europe, so you can probably see some of this stuff in person. But you might see in medieval artwork like a kind of a crude picture of the earth, or a series of spheres, like one inside the other, like an onion kind of going out. Like if you cut an onion in two. And basically that's the depiction of the Ptolemaic cosmology. And sometimes they'll show in the earth hell as like a mouth eating a bunch of people, or a dog's head with a bunch of people inside being devoured, like all the sinners that are being sent to hell. Because they also believe that hell was in the center of the earth, which I believe is actually a holdover from Greek mythology, where they thought that the realm of Hades was in the center of the earth beneath the ground. It's actually kind of a silly idea. From a modern perspective, the idea of hell or the afterlife being inside the earth, because there's going to be less space inside the earth than there is on the surface. So you can't just have people dying and going there and going there and going there. Eventually you're going to run out of space. I do think hell is real, but not inside the earth. So, but that's what our ancestors believed. They placed it inside the earth.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I do want to point out that actually we know very little about the inside of our Earth. Like we have some general theories, and we have some calculations that show like what the core of Earth should be made of, some sort of liquid metal. But really, there's like still tons of mysteries about the inside of our Earth. anyway, just wanted to put that in there.
Yeah, no, I agree. But actually, that when we were kids, they were teaching that it was liquid. The core was liquid. But I think today the official view is that it's solid. The core is solid. It's made out of heavy metal supposedly, and then that's surrounded by the liquid magma. And then by the time you get to the crust, it's solid again, but less dense than the core. And I don't know, I don't accept something as true just because the establishment or the official scientific consensus says so. Like, that doesn't really hold a lot of weight with me unless I can also see their methodology that they used, and I agree with their methodology. But I believe the way that they arrived at this conclusion was through sonar and doing different sonar scans, I guess, on different parts of the Earth, sending the sound waves towards the core. And based on that, they've concluded that it's solid. I know there's a lot of people today, maybe not a lot, but there's a few that think that the Earth is hollow and there's like a hidden realm inside the Earth. And the Edgar Rice Burroughs stories, they kind of played up on that. And there's something in Hinduism that kind of implies that there's a world inside the world. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think it probably is not true. I think it's probably going to be the hardest and the most dense at the center. But at any rate, the Ptolemaic cosmology was not predicated on the idea of gravity. It was predicated on the Aristotelian theories about the elements, there being 5 elements in their motions. So, at any rate, getting back to the...
And the 5th element being ether, right?
Yeah, ether, and sometimes also called, what's the other thing here? Quintessence, yeah.
Okay.
So usually ether is
because
called...
with that ether, we might get a bunch of crypto bots commenting on our video. We'll see.
Well, ether, you'll see it coming up in entertainment, like in anime and in different like sci-fi and fantasy stories.
Yeah, well, you have the sci-fi movie, The Fifth Element, right? So.
Yeah, but I think in that movie, the 5th element was actually that woman, right? It wasn't. It wasn't ether.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah.
But I've seen it appearing in like anime and other things. So.
I was more referring to Ethereum, which is like a Bitcoin alternative, I think. So.
Yeah, and they probably named it after the element. They like the idea of this being more perfect or heavenly.
Yeah, non-changing.
Yeah. So I've got a quote here I want to read from the medieval period, and this comes from a book called The Sphere of Sacrobosco by a guy named Johannes de Sacrobosco, and this was written in the early 13th century. And basically, the book, if you want to read it, it can be downloaded for free as a PDF. So I'll put the link in the description below if anyone's interested. But he just talks about the shape and structure of the universe and the world. So here's a quote from it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. So the first section, the 4 elements. The machine of the universe is divided into 2, the ethereal and the elementary region. The elementary region, existing subject to continual alteration, is divided into 4, for there is earth, placed as it were as the center in the middle of it all, about which is water, about water air, about air fire, which is pure and not turbid there, and reaches to the sphere of the moon, as Aristotle says in his book Meteorology. For so God, the glorious and sublime, deposed. And there are called the 4 elements, which are in turn by themselves altered, corrupted, and regenerated. The elements are also simple bodies which cannot be subdivided into parts of diverse forms, and from whose commixture are produced various species of generated things. 3 of them, in turn, surround the earth on all sides spherically, except insofar as the dry land stays the sea's tide to protect the life of animate beings. All 2 are mobile, except earth, which is the center of the world, by its weight in every direction, equally avoiding the great motion of the extremes, as a round body occupies the middle of the sphere. The heavens. Around the elementary region revolves with continuous circular motion, the ethereal, which is lucid and immune from all variations in its immutable essence, and it is called fifth essence by the philosophers, of which there are 9 spheres, as we have just said, namely of the moon, Mercury, Venus, the sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the fixed stars, and the last heaven. Each of these spheres encloses its inferior spherically. So the book is much longer than that, but I just chose the part where he's talking about the 5 elements. So again, like the scientific worldview for 1,000 years was this, that there's just 5 elements, and that the Earth is in the center of the universe. And I'm sure you've heard of Dante Alighieri.
Yes, of course.
Did you? How much? Did you read his books?
Dante's Inferno. I have not read the book. No.
So
I think I saw a video about it during English class back in high school a long time ago. So
they didn't make you guys read it over there?
No, because English was like a second language. So
yeah, but the Inferno wasn't written in English; it was written in Italian.
Yeah, I think we got the Shakespearean version of it. Is that possible?
I don't know. I don't know that Shakespeare, like I didn't know that he translated it. I've never heard of that before. When I was in 12th grade, I read the Inferno, and of course originally it was written in Italian, and that was actually pretty significant because till then most of the literature, whether it's entertainment or scientific or historic, was written in Latin. But Dante decided to write in Italian so that the average person could understand it, provided they could read. And Dante, he lived, from 1265 AD to 1321. And Inferno is usually what people think of when they hear Dante, but he actually wrote 3 books. So there's Inferno and Purgatorio and Paradiso. And when I was in 12th grade, they made me read the Inferno, and I actually enjoyed it. And the version that I read was translated by a guy named John Chiardi, who I guess it's not a perfect direct translation, but he wanted to have it rhyme in English, so he made it so that it could rhyme in English when he translated it. So it's probably not a perfect translation because what rhymes in Italian doesn't necessarily rhyme in English. But if you read Dante, in case anybody doesn't know anything at all, basically, Inferno, the first story in the sequence, Dante goes to hell, and then Purgatorio, the second, he goes to purgatory, which is a Roman Catholic belief. They don't just believe in heaven and hell; they also believe in another place called purgatory, where you have a chance to go to heaven after you die, basically, and people can pray for you, and maybe you'll make it out of purgatory into heaven. And if not, I guess eventually you get demoted down to hell. But then Paradiso, the third book in the sequence, he goes to heaven. So Dante's all 3 books together are called the Divine Comedy, and it's predicated on to some extent Roman Catholic theology, because I think they're the only people that has any concept of purgatory. I know the Orthodox, they don't have it. They have heaven and hell, and I haven't heard of any other denomination having that concept. But there's that, and then also the Ptolemaic cosmology. So in Dante's Divine Comedy, hell is in the center of the earth, and he descends through that. And then purgatory, he puts it on the surface of the earth, but it's on the opposite side of Jerusalem. And then for paradise, he has the Ptolemaic cosmology, where the different spheres are different layers of heaven. So after he ascends past the air and the fire, he goes to the sphere of the moon. And while he's there, as he's going into the sphere, it looks like a perfect crystalline object like a pearl. And he asks Beatrice, who is his tour guide, hey, how come now that I'm close to the moon, I don't see any modeling, the mottling pattern? And the thing is, like, the modeling on the surface of the moon was also an issue for the Aristotelian ideas of ether being smooth and perfect. And it was an issue for the Ptolemaic cosmology as well, because it's kind of against the notion that the heavenly spheres are perfect. It's clearly a modeled surface. So what Dante does is there's a passage here where Beatrice kind of gives some justification for the appearance of modeling that you see from Earth, which in Paradiso you don't see when you're getting close to the moon. So I'm just going to read a little bit of this here. Let's see here. This varying power is variously infused throughout the precious body that it quickens, in which life in you it is diffused. Because of the glad nature from which it flows, the many-faceted power shines through that body, as through the living eye that glad soul glows. From this source only, not from rare and dense, comes that by which one light and another differs, the formal principle whose excellence, conforming to its own purposes, makes appear those markings you observe as dark and clear. So I had to read this a few times to really kind of understand it. But basically what she's saying is you're only imagining that you see the modeling there on the surface of the moon. It doesn't have anything to do with the surface being imperfect or there being differences in density, but it's because the light that's diffusing through the universe doesn't diffuse evenly. And so some places are lighter and some places are darker when you're looking at the moon, but it's just an illusion. Does that make sense? So one of the reasons for this is that I don't know if I mentioned this before, but at some point the Catholic Church accepted the Ptolemaic cosmology. Like before the Catholic Church came into existence, the Ptolemaic cosmology was the worldview, like the official scientific consensus. So when they came onto the scene, they just assumed that it was true, and the Bible doesn't really say what the shape of the universe or the solar system is or the order of the planets or anything like that. So they're like, well, I guess, that this is true because that's what the scientists are saying, and therefore this has to be the way that God did it. So they made it canon, which means that if later on you were to challenge the Ptolemaic cosmology and say, well, maybe, the moon is not a perfect sphere, or maybe this retrograde motion doesn't make sense, and the only way for planets to be moving in regular motions is if they're moving around another central point apart from Earth. Like, you couldn't criticize the Ptolemaic cosmology, because if you did, you were a heretic, according to the Catholic Church. So that's actually the final bit that I want to cover is what ultimately killed the Ptolemaic cosmology. So the beginning of the end was Nicholas Copernicus, who lived from 1473 to 1543. And he was a Polish astronomer who proposed a heliocentric model for the solar system. And he worked it all out by way of math, and his model was pretty accurate, pretty close to the actual thing. And he wanted to have a better model to explain the solar system and account for the appearance of retrograde motion. So, the whole idea of retrograde motion was a problem for this Ptolemaic cosmology all along. Retrograde motion is not caused by planets. He said that it was not caused by the motion or by the motion of the planets directly, but rather due to a changing perspective based on Earth. Earth is also moving, and you're seeing it from a different vantage point, and the planets are not actually moving backwards, for a time. They're actually continuously moving in the same direction. What he said is that planets do orbit in perfect circles and are still moved by celestial spheres made out of aether, but the sun is the center that everything is moving around, not the earth. So Copernicus published his findings in his book on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres in 1543. And actually, he died a little bit later in the same year that he published his book. So why did he delay so much? Well, he was afraid of the Catholic Church because they had already made, as I mentioned before, they had already made the Ptolemaic Cosmology canon. So if you went against it, you could be charged as a heretic. And the penalty for heresy was to get burned at the stake. So yeah, he was afraid of the Catholic Church, so he waited and waited before he released his data. And actually, he was protected a little bit because the Protestant Reformation had weakened the influence in the Catholic Church in Northern Europe. So it wasn't quite as easy for them to execute him as it would have been in the past. But still, he waited. And so then the next thing is a guy named Tycho Brahe. I might be pronouncing it wrong. Tycho Brahe lived from 1546 to 1601. And in 1577, he showed that a comet, which was passing through the solar system, would have to go through multiple celestial spheres, and therefore they must not exist because these things are supposed to be solid. So if there's an object passing through all these spheres, then how can that be if there's these solid spheres? Maybe that model needs to be called into question. And then the next challenge comes from Galileo Galilei, who I'm sure you've heard of. And Galileo lived from 1564 to 1642. From 1609 to 1612, he used new telescopes, some of which he designed by himself. He made improvements on that technology. To observe mountains on the moon, new satellites around Jupiter, and phases of Venus and sunspots. And all of these things were in contradiction to the Ptolemaic model, which proposed that the heavenly objects were smooth and flawless and were not supposed to have blemishes or irregularities in their surface. So, like something like back then saying, hey, there's mountains on the moon, that was considered controversial and it was heresy. And satellites around Jupiter was another problem for the Ptolemaic cosmology, because Jupiter is supposed to be something that is moving around a point itself, and it's of course ensconced within a sphere of aether. So finding other things moving around Jupiter calls that model into question. And then phases of Venus, why is that a problem? Well, because the belief is that Venus was a solid point of light. It is a source of light, or it was supposed to be a source of light. It wasn't supposed to be something that is reflecting light from another object. So, and of course, sunspots, same kind of thing. The sun is supposed to be smooth and perfect. So in 1616, the Catholic Church issued a prohibition against Copernicus's cosmology. So they came out and they officially warned everybody that going against the Ptolemaic cosmology is considered heresy. And Copernicus's book called Revolutions was banned, the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. And Galileo was warned in advance of what they were going to do before they issued the official decree. And they told him, make sure you stop teaching heliocentrism. And Galileo complied with it. He agreed to go along with it, even though he was, convinced that the Ptolemaic cosmology was wrong. So in doing so, he avoids having his name mentioned as a heretic or a bad influence when the ban is pronounced. And then in 1623, a new pope is elected, and this guy's name was Urban Urban the Eighth, who was actually an admirer of Galileo. He thought Galileo was a smart guy and a good guy. So Galileo feels a little more confident, and he starts working on another book to kind of promote the heliocentric cosmology without officially violating the ban. But what he's doing is he's going to test the waters because he wants to get his view out there. In 1632, he publishes the Dialogue of the Two Chief World Systems, Ptolemaic and Copernican, which is like a argumentative dialogue. It was kind of a fiction story. I haven't read it, so I don't know much. Like, I don't know all the details, but it presents evidence for both sides, where two different guys are in a debate, and they give their data to support each of their positions. And the book avoids making a conclusion either way. But the way that it's written, the arguments for the heliocentric view are stronger. And basically, this was an attempt to get around the ban on the heliocentric cosmology by just presenting it as a theoretical dialogue between two guys. And of course, the Catholic Church, they know what he's really doing. So in 1633, Galileo is put on trial for suspected heresy and placed under house arrest, and his book is banned, and he was prevented from being convicted as a full heretic. So what I found out is, suspected heresy means that you get like a kind of a life sentence, but then there's something else called formal heresy, where your heresy is a matter of fact or not a matter of it's self-evident, it's not debatable. And if you're convicted of formal heresy, the penalty is that you get burned to death. So Galileo was not killed, but he was stopped from publishing more books and teaching about his theories. So in 1758, the Catholic Church eventually they declared that heliocentrum is not heresy after all, and I believe it was Pope Benedict the 14th who presided over that. And then by 1835, they completely lift the ban on Copernicus's books, and so there's a bit. It takes a bit longer for them to kind of change their views on it, because they had the doctrine of papal infallibility, where if a pope declares something, then it's supposed to be it's canon, even if it's not in the Bible. They're kind of bound to this stuff once it's declared, and it's harder for them to change. So what happens is when Copernicus publishes his book and moving on from then, it takes a bit longer for the heliocentric worldview to take hold in countries that are predominantly Catholic, and the countries that are predominantly Protestant, they accept it more quickly because they don't really have any source of theology that's outside of the Bible. Although to be fair, when Martin Luther was alive, he actually thought that the heliocentric view was stupid. He didn't think it was heresy necessarily, but he thought it was a stupid idea. And that was pretty much the argument for geocentrism in the ancient world, in the medieval world, was, well, I don't feel any motion, so obviously the Earth has to be stationary. But it took a while to kind of weed out this worldview, which was predominant for so long, over 1,000 years. And even today, there's still some people that say that the Ptolemaic cosmology is the correct one. And I saw this on, I read a bunch of different articles and, different things for this. And I saw a survey, which I'm not going to put in the sources because I have my doubts about it. But there's this group that conducted a survey, and they said that 20% of the population of the United States still believes that the Earth is the center of the universe. They still have some kind of geocentric cosmology, and like 20% seems like a high number to me. So I don't really know, but I do know that I have encountered people in real life that were like, why do you care about outer space? You know, there's nothing there. You can't go into space. Earth is all there is. Like, I've encountered those kind of people before. So I guess they do still exist. I guess people are still adhering to the Ptolemaic cosmology to some extent. And then, of course, you know, you also see the Ptolemaic cosmology figuring into astrology and the horoscopes, like the Mars is in retrograde motion, so now this is going to happen, and Venus is in retrograde motion, so now this is going to happen, and the planets are aligning, so blah blah blah, and beware of this or that. I usually don't read that stuff. In fact, I have a lot of contempt for that stuff. The astrology. I think it's really stupid, but it does have some connection to the Ptolemaic cosmology. So at any rate, that's all I got. I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
No, I was doing some research online. I think Dante was also influenced by the Muslim view on which was also Ptolemaic on the world.
Yeah. How
And
was
did you know that? Because there are 7 layers of hell in Islam, and there are also 7 layers of heaven, and even because I remember from the Quran that a meteor is whenever a meteor hits Earth, um, because they thought that it was going through the spheres. That was the people at the time, the Arabs, thought it was like the announcement of something great. So anyway, I was just reading up on it. Apparently, the companions of Muhammad used to say that so a great man was born, but then Muhammad said that these meteors were shot neither at the death or birth of anyone, or because of, but they were when Allah decides to issue a command, His words are transmitted from one group of angels to another throughout the 7 heavens. So it's the same thing, the spheres. In this process of transmission, the jinn, it's like the evil spirits, attempt to eavesdrop on what is going on. And they want to snatch what they can manage to overhear and carry to their friends, which are non believers, sorcerers, fortune tellers, and astrologers. And when the angels see the jinn doing so, they attack them with meteors. So, and then apparently Muhammad said, if the jinn narrate only which they manage to snatch, that is correct, but they alloy it with lies and make additions to it. And then in the Quran it says, this is what I read when I read the Quran. Indeed, we have adorned the nearest heaven with an adornment of stars, and as protection against every rebellious devil, so they may not listen to the exalted assembly of angels, and are pelted from every side, repelled, and for them is a constant punishment, except one who snatches some words by theft, but they are pursued by a burning flame piercing in brightness. So anyway, and apparently the word for throwing meteors at the jinn is rajm. I'm not saying that right. It basically means stoning, and that's the same word that they use when somebody who has committed adultery also receives stoning. It also means missile, projectile, and even meteor. Aren't some of the Iranian missiles called Rajam as well? I'm pretty sure they are.
I don't know. But you said, so Quran says that the stars are the nearest heaven?
Sorry, what was that?
You just, like, the Quran said that the stars are the nearest heaven?
Did I say that?
Stars are, I don't think, I know during the medieval period, Muslims, like after they expanded and they took over like the Byzantine realms, they encountered the Ptolemaic cosmology, because the Muslims did have their own scientists. Not at first. At first, they were just like desert nomads, but they did start having their own scientific community, and they just took the Ptolemaic cosmology. You know, probably after they took control of Egypt, because that's where it started in the first place. The Ptolemaic.
Yeah, and I think Aristotle was actually one of the Greek philosophers or probably the Greek philosopher they respected the most.
Yeah, well, Ptolemy, he also respected Aristotle a lot. And, Aristotle is not, it wasn't quite the same as the Ptolemaic cosmology because Aristotle proposed that there were 55 spheres, a lot more.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And he didn't really have any, he didn't really have any mathematics behind it, as far as I know, and no explanation for retrograde motion. Like he thought that the motions of the heavenly bodies were constant and perfect. So Claudius Ptolemy tried to bail him out. Like he basically tried to mathematically and scientifically justify the Aristotelian cosmology, but then he amended it because he got rid of most of the spheres as well. And then the Arabs they adopted this ideology as well. I know one thing is, well, maybe I don't know this. It's been a while, and I haven't read all of the Quran, but I think the Muslims, they actually believe that Adam and Eve started outside of Earth, and then they were thrown down to it after they were expelled from Eden, something like that. I could be wrong. And Muhammad, I don't know if he had any influence from Greek culture or Egyptian culture or Ptolemaic cosmology. He thought that the sun set in a pool of muddy water. I was just thinking, but then of course later on they adopted so after he was dead, that's when they would have accepted the Ptolemaic cosmology as a fact.
Yeah.
But
well, I mean, and just similar to what the Catholics believe, the Muslims also believe that there's like a realm of punishment, which is like the first realm of hell,
yeah,
like a purgatory sort of thing, where apparently all the Muslims go, and then when they've paid for their sins, then they can go to their one of the 7 levels of heaven. So, yeah,
well,
it's pretty
maybe
interesting.
maybe he did borrow some Islamic ideas, but he also put, like Dante, he also put Muhammad in hell.
Yeah.
And some of the other Muslim characters, he put them there as well. Like there was one guy, I don't remember, like one of the major Islamic heroes. Um, it's been a few years since I've read Dante, but there's this circle of hell where there's a demon with a sword or something, and people are walking in a circle, and then he cuts them and mutilates them in different ways, and like one guy has his head cut off and he has to carry it in his hand as he goes. And these people, they get mutilated by this demon, and then as they walk around the circle, they gradually heal and they become whole again. And then the demon they get back to the point where they started, and the demon messes them up again. I think it was either Muhammad or Ali that was there. But then he also has like mosques in hell, like the city of Dis. He talks about there being mosques, and I think furnaces there. It's been a long time since I read.
Yeah.
I need to read it again.
Apparently, that's also there's one of the 7 realms of hell in the Quran. It also is a place where you get there's like all these torments, and it also like your body regrows. Even in the first realm of hell, like your flesh will burn off, and then it will regrow, and then it will burn off again.
So you're like a skeleton walking around for a while.
Yeah, and then your flesh will come back, and then.
Yeah,
so yeah.
I bet hell is worse than anything that people have ever imagined. I don't even
I
know.
imagine so as well, but it's clear, I guess, that they're both influenced by the Greek version of Hades and some of the Ptolemaic worldview. So where you
Yeah,
put hell in the center of the earth. So or
you
this.
know, who else put the afterlife in the center of the earth was the Sumerians. They called it Nergal, but in their version, it's like a shadowy realm, and it doesn't really make any difference what you do in life. You're gonna go to Nergal either way. Yeah, it's like a realm of like kind of shadow and darkness. Kind of interesting. I started researching that a while ago, then I just stopped. I was trying to find out I was actually writing a story, like a fiction about Ashur Nasser Pal II. I was going to use him as a villain. like bring him back. And I'm like, I got to find out what these people actually believe about the afterlife, so that I can, accurately do the character and have him give his own explanation for what happened. And so I did some research, and I found out that the Assyrians pretty much had very similar views to the Sumerians. They were related. I think they were. I believe the Assyrians, yeah, they kind of splintered off, but they had the same afterlife views of Nurgle. And also another thing about the Assyrians is the way that they justified a lot of their stuff that they did is they just said Asher wills it. So
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting, people that think that the afterlife is beneath the earth. Now I wonder what causes that idea. I'm wondering, like, if it has to do with because you bury the bodies underground, maybe the soul keeps going further into the ground. I have no idea.
Maybe because of the fire. Like if you live in a place with volcanoes and things like that, you'll think of that as like, oh man. And then people that have like some of these near-death experiences, they really go into like these fires and torments and stuff like that. So they imagine it's dark. Well, the near-death experience is dark, so that's why they may have thought it was like inside the earth somehow.
Yeah. Like in Hinduism, there's a world inside the world, but it's not a place of torment. It's just like a world inside the world. And there's also more worlds above the world, and different beings live there.
Is there no hell in Hinduism?
No, there's not. There's no hell. You just it's like the idea is Hinduism is you want to keep
Buddhism has a hell though. That's interesting.
I don't know. I haven't heard. I mean, maybe I haven't heard about that, but like usually with Hinduism, the punishment that you get is you get reincarnated as a lower status or as a lower form of life. And the goal is to keep getting reincarnated as a higher and higher being until eventually you're not reincarnated anymore.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in Buddhism, which was Buddhism the offshoot of Hinduism or Hinduism? Okay.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a hell in Buddhism called Naraka.
Huh.
And it's a hell realm or purgatory. And people are like cooked alive and stuff like that as fire, demons, people being impaled. So interesting.
Yeah, I haven't heard that before. Like my understanding, like Buddhism, I know that the founder, he was actually like an upper class Hindu, high caste. I think he was a Kshatriya, and he came up with this idea that the way to defeat the cycle of reincarnation was to get away from desire. And so he worked on creating they called it like I think it was called the middle path or something like that. I don't remember everything. It's been so long. I don't want to say something that's wrong. So.
Okay.
But yeah.
Buddhism, I know there's 9 different levels of hell. And so people are being cooked alive. And like in the 8th level, it's in an immense blazing oven. They're being roasted, and their life is 3,3,9,7,3,8,6,2,4 times 10 to the 18th power of years long, which I don't know. That's like millions of years or something. So interesting. Yeah.
Getting all mathematical about it.
Yeah.
Yeah, math is one of those things that just makes my brain shut off. Like I know it's very important and it's necessary and you can't have civilization without it, but I just can't. I just can't handle all that stuff. My brain just shuts off like a light whenever we get into complex math, which is and you want to know what's sad is, according to my IQ test, I have above average math skills, so I can only imagine how bad the average person must be at math. It must be like counting on your fingers and or toes, and then when you run out of fingers and toes, you don't know what to do. But anyway,
All
yeah.
right, man. Well, I appreciate it. Thanks for the. Now I know what the Ptolemaic system is and some of its history and how it got displaced. And yeah, thought it was a good one.
Yeah, if you have any really old, well, you live in the Netherlands, but like maybe when next time you go to France or if you go to Spain or Italy, look in like some of those medieval Catholic churches, like Gothic churches, if they have artwork like the like painted stuff, you'll see in some places this image of concentric circles, and that's what it is. It's their depiction of the universe, and if there's like somebody outside of it kind of holding it or editing it, then that's a depiction of God. Like there's a medieval painting, it's actually called God the Geometer, and it's based on there's a passage in the Bible, I forget where, but it talks about he drew a compass on the surface of the earth, and they show God like outside of the universe with like a little compass kind of going around the earth. I have that. I'll put it in the slideshow. You can also look it up. Just type in God the Geometer. It should show up. So,
yeah. All right, man. Yeah, appreciate it.
Yep. Great.
If anyone wants to comment, any requests, let us know. And anything else you want to say?
No, that's all. Questions, comments, feedback, anything. I know we've got like a few people that have been waiting, that put in requests, which we didn't get to yet. Eventually, we'll get to them. There's like a huge queue of things that we're going through. So eventually, we'll come to you. And if I said, like a few people, I said I would do this or that for you, like I definitely will, unless I die before then. It's definitely my intention. It's just taking me a while because I'm slow. So yeah.
All right. Cool.
All right. Thanks.